Warning. This podcast contains material that may or may not be considered appropriate for the average Trumptopian household. Listen at your own risk to Unauthorized and Explicit Reading. Disclaimer. All rights to literature referenced are retained by appropriate entities, and no infringement is intended. The reading of any and all literary materials referenced herein is done expressly for the altruistic purpose of genuinely facilitating the species-wide, pineal gland activating, third eye opening, transcendent spiritual enlightenment of all of humanity. Any and all opinions expressed herein are exclusively those of the imaginary talk show host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And now, brace yourselves for unauthorized and explicit readings. Despite the common tendency or urge to insist that science and spiritual wisdom are mutually exclusive, I suggest to you the following words and ideas as a point of convergence between science and spiritual language, scientific language and spiritual language, a convergence between both the human world of spirituality and the human world of science, and the actual things that those cultures are describing. From a post I originally shared, I think, from October 18th, 2017. And it's a post from a page entitled The Psyche as Interaction. A page about one woman's journey to explain her own paranormal experiences. PsycheAsInteraction.com. And on this particular case, I actually have expressed permission to read from this for the podcast, for which I say thank you to the lovely anonymous person behind that page. Psyche as Interaction on Facebook. Warning. The content therein is so exactingly of science, and yet is very much about the convergence of spiritual, metaphysical, phenomenological stuff. But vis-a-vis, this person took the science of it quite serious, that it can be tedious, if not downright overwhelming at times. But this is one of my favorite passages out of what I've read from what that page has shared from this book, which I believe is available both online and through standard book retailers. Oh, here's my words, what I wrote when I posted this on the Facebook page for Mr. Zeppo's Tarot Journal Cartomancy Readings Radio Hour. Side note, for those curious, I also wanted to somehow figure out a way to include bibliomancy in that whole giant word stew that is the title for that project, but I just couldn't bring myself. It was one too many multisyllabic monstrous words. But if you're curious about that, a form of bibliomancy is inherent in the system that I'm working with as I explore teaching myself how to work with tarot and other divinatory systems with the goal in mind to see if they have practical application and to see if they can render meaningful readings or not. So tune in for more of that as new episodes are in pre-production now. But here's what I had to say about the post from Psyche as Interaction when I shared it to this page, and I quote myself. Here is a possible quantum spirit explanation for how divination may work. If all, quote, moving systems equal cognition, end quote, and all objects are made manifest by the divine consciousness, as my self-support and others have postulated throughout history, then all collections of objects used in a complex enough system of movement would be capable of attenuating to and synchronizing with the user's conscious intent. So that's my introduction. Those are my words. And now from the Psyche as Interaction, Electromagnetic Patterns of Conscious Energy, Part C, Neurological Concepts, page 148 through 149. And this is actually from the appendices, I should point out. The mathematical nonlinear network relationships central to feedback loops, biological forms, social systems, ecosystems, and thought systems are one of the three characteristics of self-organizing systems as identified by the neurophysiologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela in the 1970s. They came up with a theory called the Santiago theory. Quote, in it, they correlate cognition, the process of knowing, with the process of life. Let's sit with that sentence for a hot second. In their theory, the Santiago theory, they correlate cognition, which is the process of knowing that which can be known. So anything that can be known, there is a process that we, the human individual, go through that acquires a knowingness of that which can be known. And these guys were saying that's the same process as the process that we can identify and label life. Continuing with the reading here, they stress their concern with organization as a process, not a structure. Organization is a process, not a structure. A structure, if I may comment here for a minute, a structure inherently is considered inert. A process is considered active. It is an ongoing event, right? Okay, so they stress the idea that organization is a process, not a structure, and they invent the term autopoiesis to describe their concept of circular organization. Auto, of course, means self and refers to the autonomy of the self-organizing system, and poiesis, which shares the same Greek root as the word poetry, means making. So autopoiesis means self-making. Let's sit with that sentence for a hot second. Originally, Maturana was interested in color perception, which Varela, his student, followed up on in his book, The Embodied Mind, which, quote, led me to a discovery that was extraordinarily important for me. The nervous system operates as a closed network of interactions, in which every change of the interactive relations between certain components always results in a change of the interactive relations of the same or of other components. As Capra points out, quote, he hypothesized that the, quote, circular organization, end quote, of the nervous system is the basic organization of all living systems, brackets, which all have the same DNA and all have carbon, end brackets. Quote, living systems are organized in a closed causal circular process that allows for evolutionary change in the way the circularity is maintained, but not for the loss of the circularity itself. Secondly, Maturana postulated, and this is a quotation inside the quotation I'm reading from, quote, postulated that the nervous system is not only self-organizing, but also continually self-referring, so that the perception cannot be viewed as the representation of an external reality, but must be understood as the continual creation of new relationships within the neural network. The activities of nerve cells do not reflect an environment independent of the living organism, and hence do not allow for the construction of an absolutely existing external world. Let's sit with that sentence for a hot second. The activities of nerve cells do not reflect an environment independent of the living organism, and hence do not allow for the construction of an absolutely existing external world. Capra concludes, quote, according to Maturana, perceptions and, more generally, cognition do not represent an external reality, but rather specify one through the nervous system's process of circular organization. From this premise, Maturana then took the radical step of postulating that the process of circular organization itself, with or without a nervous system, is identical to the process of cognition. Internal quote, living systems are cognitive systems, and living as a process is a process of cognition. This statement is valid for all organisms with and without nervous systems. End quote. Okay. So the mind has already been described by other scientists than this one, and in other books besides this one, as being not quite as deeply anchored in the flesh that we find within the brain case. It's still a critical piece of the whole puzzle, well, that fleshy thing we call the brain, but it's not the root source, perhaps, of thoughts. Others have said that, right? Others have decentralized our mental experience from the sponge cake in our skull. But we haven't really had clarity about what that actually means or represents. I think our friend here, our anonymous friend, quoting various scientists, quoting other scientists, brings to us a patchwork of theoretical statements that might map out a very interesting real phenomenon. At least attempt to, right? Because they are theoretical statements. Here's one of the places where we can seek out validation. There's always this ambiguous relegation, this sort of prejudice against plant life, despite the fact that we share massive blocks of our genome with our brothers and sisters, the plants. Most normal people relegate them to a sort of unconscious and inanimate status. And why would that be? They live really fascinating, very slow motion lives, which we just sort of neglect. When we go to that science and look there, there's this curious phenomena of science and scientists studying plant life and finding weird, strange indications that there must be some form of consciousness associated with the plant, despite it having a complete and total lack of brain stem and other commonly misassociated items or categories of cellular structures, right, that we would commonly associate with or misassociate with consciousness. But despite there being a lack of such structures in almost all plants, science has for some time now been going, but yet they curiously seem to exhibit behaviors that we must categorize as exhibiting some forms of awareness, because otherwise, the fuck are they doing that for, right? And this has been going on for decades now. Once we got into long-term studies of plants, how they relate to their environment, how they react to their environment, especially once we started taking into account their structures that exist underground, which, like an iceberg, turns out to be the vast majority of where they express their, the vast majority of their bulk, and the vast majority of where they express their behaviors for most plant species. For most plant species, not all, for most plant species, the nub on the top, the green bits that we can look at without digging, are the tip of the iceberg to what that body of cellular mass is actually doing and how it's actually doing it. Once we started to go, oh, duh, right, and started figuring out ways to analyze the growth patterns to try to call it a thing that isn't behavior and thus obviously driven by consciousness, we wanted to analyze the growth patterns of these underground cellular structures of plants. We started finding that, the root structures are way more important than the vast majority of what's going on above ground to the health and well-being of the plant, and that the root structures do indeed exhibit behavioral type growth phenomena. Like their roots grow in such a way that the roots seem to be exhibiting behavior. And I'll leave it to you to go find that out. Just type in plants and behavior, secret life of plants, evidence that plants have consciousness. Just Google that shit. There's plenty of decent science, and watch the videos, look at the documentaries, and look at the footage for yourself and go, does that look CGI'd or does that look like an actual plant actually doing that? My opinion is, after having read what I've read, having looked at that enough for myself, that increasingly over time, even mainstream science will have to acknowledge that plants have some forms of awareness, and that is driven by a consciousness associated to their species as well as their individual plant body forms. And that's something that, my dear friends, if you haven't heard it before, it's because there's a whole massive system of oppression out there trying to keep you from hearing it. But that's something that our ancient ancestors that lived in tribal ways understood. That consciousness resides both at the species-wide level and at the individual level for everything that's alive. And that our definition of alive today is pejorative, limiting, and honestly, horribly inaccurate. I'll leave you at that precipice of crazy statements to sit and contemplate